Good afternoon and welcome back to the A4S Summit. So far today, we've been looking at some of the big picture solutions that are going to help us to achieve a sustainable future. Now we're going to deep dive into some of the accounting innovations that might help us to get there, and in particular, accounting for Scope 3 emissions. Now, Scope 3 emissions are all of the indirect emissions that occur in a value chain of an organisation, including both upstream and downstream. For many organisations, this makes up the greatest proportion of their emissions. But because it's outside the scope of their own control, their own operations, often the most difficult to measure accurately and to reduce. To kick off the session, I'm delighted to be joined by two rock stars of the academic world, Professor Robert Kaplan from Harvard Business School and Professor Karthik Ramanna from Oxford. Professor Kaplan co-developed both activity-based costing and the balanced scorecard, widely recognised as seminal contributions to management theory and practice, and approaches that I'm sure many of us, myself included, have used in our daily work for a long time. In 2021, Professor Ramanna joined forces with Professor Kaplan to address the challenge of accurately measuring and reporting corporate greenhouse gas emissions across supply and distribution chains, creating the e-ledger. Now, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the nature of the problem that they were trying to solve and more about the solution that they've come up with and how that's being scaled up in practice and how it might be relevant for you. Bob, Karthik, it's fantastic to have both of you with us. To get us started, Karthik, I'd like to turn to you first. Can you tell us more about the problem that you're trying to solve?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for having us here. And we're delighted to be able to speak to the audience at A4S and to hopefully help improve on the already incredible work that this community is doing. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? Basically, we are trying to be able to put a specific emissions value on any product or service produced in the economy. Consider, for instance, this iPhone. This iPhone is produced from thousands of components across perhaps hundreds of layers of supply chain. And yet Apple seems to know down to the microcent what is the cost associated with producing this iPhone. That seems like on the surface an informationally impossible problem to solve. And yet somehow Apple has figured it out. And by the way, it's not just Apple, it's any corporation in the world, any entity, in fact, that uses financial accounting knows what is the embedded cost in its products or services. So this conversation we're having now on Zoom will have an embedded cost on it to Zoom, which Zoom will know how to calculate. In the same way, we imagine that you can calculate the embedded emissions in any product or service in the economy. So say 1 hour of a Zoom call will have an embedded emissions value to it. One iPhone here will have an embedded emissions value to it. And by the way, the embedded emissions value of this iPhone will be different from the embedded emissions value of the iPhone sitting on your desk, Jessica, because those were presumably produced in different batches. And that's the beauty of the accounting system, that it allows you to track the embedded emissions or the embedded costs in any product or service produced in an economy. Why does this matter? It's not just an exercise of accounting for accounting's sake, because as you start calculating these embedded emissions cradle to gate, what you are able to do is identify actions that might contribute to decarbonization. Just like managers in supply chains or production managers on site, as they start tracking their cost and quality, make decisions to ensure that a product of a certain expected quality is delivered at a certain cost threshold. In the same way, measuring embedded emissions of products and services in real time at the batch level as they're being incurred in supply chains helps supply chain managers, helps production managers decarbonize their operations. So that becomes a very important use for this kind of real-time information. That is first and foremost the problem we're trying to solve. When we solve that problem at the level of individual products and services, we can then aggregate it up to the level of entire entities. So just like you construct the balance sheet, the financial balance sheet of a company by adding up what happens at the individual transactions, events, or conditions, you can compute a environmental ledger of any organization by adding up the embedded emissions of its products or services. Now, why is that kind of portfolio or corporate level environmental ledger important? Well, it's important partly if you think that the financial services sector can play a role in decarbonization. For instance, if you're an asset manager and you're trying to calculate what are the emissions under management, analogous to your assets under management, then having these kinds of e-ledgers for each one of your individual portfolio companies will be the only way you can actually calculate in real time what are the emissions under management. And that then allows you to, again, make certain financing decisions, investment or divestment decisions that drive decarbonization. So again, the accounting at that level of accuracy and that level of verifiability and that level of timeliness contributes to decarbonization both on the demand side as well as on the supply side. And that's the problem that our accounting solution hopes to solve.
So Bob, maybe you could say a little bit more about the solution that you've come up with to address the challenges or the needs that Karthik summarized there.
So as Karthik mentioned, when we encountered the set of problems about 3 years ago, we realized that what looks like an unsolvable problem, how could companies like, like Apple or Microsoft or BMW or Boeing possibly understand the emissions that are in their supply chain when they have 10,000 tier one suppliers, and each of their tier one suppliers has hundreds of thousands of their own, all the way down to a tier 6 or tier 8. It seems like an impossible task, especially since these companies don't even know the names of 85% of all the suppliers in their supply chain. So thinking about it as a top-down process just is computationally impossible. But we realize actually if you take the accounting perspective and look at it from the other end, start with the original emitters of greenhouse gases. Let's adopting the industry semantic, call those the scope 1 emissions. And start at the beginning. And so let's take an example of a car door manufacturer. And where's the beginning? The beginning is a set of companies somewhere in Australia or in Africa that are mining the original ore that will eventually go into the steel, or the people that are growing products that will become the fabric, or getting oil and natural gas that is refined into synthetic fibers that go, into the covers, and the fabrics. And so if each of those companies, those originating companies, whether you're an extraction company, or an agricultural company, or oil and gas, or also extraction, if they could measure their scope 1 emissions, the direct emissions that they are producing in their production of their materials, and then allocate it to their outputs in a very, very similar to cost accounting. So each of its outputs, each ton of iron ore, each ton of metallurgical coal, each kiloliter of natural gas, we know the carbon content for that production. Then when they put it in the next stage, which would typically be a transportation stage, then the transportation organization, whether it's a barge or it's a railroad or a truck, would add its scope 1 emissions, the fuel it is producing in order to transport it, and allocate that to all the products, in their boxes or their railroad car by volume or by weight. And then when the next stage comes, the buying company now has a report on all the carbon content in each one of the products that it's dropping off to the next user. And then they can add their scope 1 emissions. And it just goes naturally up the chain, the same way as Karthik described, the cost of goods sold flows up even the most complex and diverse supply chains in the world. And the beauty of this is that the companies need only get information from their immediate suppliers, who they all know. And so in addition to understanding the prices that they're paying, they will also understand the carbon content in every single one of the products or services that it's purchasing. Then it adds its own, assigns it to its outputs. And this is a process very similar to activity-based costing that I've had some role in developing, taking common shared expenses, driving it out to your output products. They pass it on to their immediate customers. So the only communication that needs to be done is between your immediate suppliers and your immediate customers, as long as every company in the global economy is using this algorithm. Now, obviously, we can't have this in place by December 23 or even by the end of March 2024. This will be a journey, but it's a journey where each step is not that complex, and we'll get better at it. You know, each iteration will include more materials. Our inputs will include more suppliers, and our suppliers will go deeper in their supply chain. And through this recursive process, we believe in a period, 3 to 5 years, that we can get to a global system of carbon accounting that will be relatively easy and inexpensive for each company to use, with the features that the Scope 1 emissions are measured once and only once at the place where they occur. So there's no multiple counting. And they can be audited at that place as well, because we need assurance that the data coming up downstream is valid. And through new information technology, such as blockchain and tokenization, those audit reports can accompany, in effect, the data as it flows down the supply chain. And we can get to a solution here where the accuracy and the reliability of the carbon data is as strong as financial accounting and reporting data are today. And the final part is it's a very simple report that companies produce. It's basically a carbon inventory account that looks exactly like a manufacturing company's inventory account today, where you start with your opening emissions that you have yet to transfer downstream to customers. You add in all the purchased emissions that period, plus the emissions that you produce, your own Scope 1 emissions, and then you identify how much of those emissions, which are now in your finished products, get transferred downstream, leaving you with a residual balance at the end of the period. So every single company's carbon accounting report will look the same. Just very simple spread, almost T account or inventory account, but it's an inventory of the carbon, just as we have inventory of costs.
Karthik, that sounds like a very elegant solution to something that's really important in terms of having the base information for decision making to accelerate progress and reduce emissions. But how do we go from where we are now to scale? And particularly, Bob, you were saying in a 3 to 5 year time frame. Clearly, we need to do that, or even quicker, from a climate perspective. But how do we go from where we are now?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jessica. So one of the first people to call us when we first published the paper in November 2021 was the head of one of the world's largest securities market regulators. And he said, guys, this is a really interesting idea. Who's doing this? And Bob and I looked at each other, looked at him and said, well, no one's doing it. We just dreamt it up in our offices. And this regulator very wisely said, well, that's a problem. I can't build a regulation around something no one's ever done before. So why don't you go get a few people to try it out? And we've taken that individual's advice to heart. And that's why we created this not-for-profit institute to help companies pilot its adoption. And it's not just companies that are piloting the adoption. We also have, for instance, hospitals within the NHS. We're talking to several government departments here in the UK, but also in the US and globally. And so the idea is that we can start with a small network of lead steer organizations that are really interested in seeking answers in their own decarbonization journeys. So we've just finished a pilot with Hitachi Energy, and Hitachi Energy was interested in running a pilot with us, particularly because they had a problem they needed to solve. They make many products, but amongst the products they make are electrical transformers. And those electrical transformers use copper in them. And copper is a very dirty material to produce. And they were under tremendous pressure from their activists to start using more recycled copper than virgin mine copper in the manufacture of electric transformers. But their own environmental engineers were not sure that this was actually a good decision. So when they read the e-liability paper, they said, well, this might actually help us. So they came to us and we said, this is great. This is exactly the kind of problem we can help you solve because we have no horse in this race. We can help you count things. So we worked with their supplier, their supplier's supplier, their supplier's supplier's supplier, all the way up to the copper mine. And likewise, look at the recycled copper supply chain. And the answer is, of course, it depends. There are certain batches of copper coming from certain mines that are so clean, they are considerably less emissions intensive than, say, recycled copper. But equally, there are certain batches of copper coming from virgin mines that are very dirty. And so Hitachi and other companies that use this kind of system can use the output of this kind of accounting to work with their suppliers and say, guys, this is the number you've got to beat if you want me to keep buying from you. So to the question of scaling, it's this problem-solving approach at the bottom, from the bottom up, that is one way in which you can think about scaling. Imagine if you've got even 50 of the Fortune 500 companies starting to embrace this as a problem-solving tool in their decarbonization journeys. That starts creating the bottom-up pressure that the regulators want to see. But the good news is that there's also increasingly some top-down pressure from the regulators as well. And the two key sources of these are coming from the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are being considered both in the EU and in the US, where there is a proposal to basically assess some sort of levy on the imports of emission-intensive materials. If you're going to have that kind of levy, you need what's called a taxable basis. And this is the only way you will have a taxable basis for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that's where there seems to be a fair bit of regulatory attention. But equally, for instance, in the United States, the government passed a bill that introduced about $300 billion of subsidies for various environmental actions. And the opposition party, the Republican Party, said, well, how do we know, for instance, that the money that's being spent, the public money that's being spent here, is in fact being spent on emissions reduction activities? We can't actually measure these things currently. So there is now a bill being passed through, moved through Congress that looks at, that's called the Prove It Act, and there are other various avatars of the Prove It Act, that basically says, if we're going to have subsidies for green actions, which we should, then we need to actually count that the public's money is being well used. And that's where, again, this kind of cradle-to-gate emission system becomes very useful as an accountability mechanism. So we see both a combination of that bottom-up problem-solving pressure and the top-down regulatory pressure that comes together to create the momentum for this to work at scale, at least in the near term.
Yeah, and if I can add, just extend Karthik's discussion here. The question is, how do you get more companies and go deeper in the supply chain? And this is a recursive approach. So version 1, which is like what happened with the copper with Hitachi Energy. Well, that's only one product. Well, version 2, they'll expand to more products. And that will mean more suppliers. That means more suppliers have to get that information. And then it starts to cycle. And if you go back to our example of extraction companies, part of their Scope 1 emissions really come from the equipment that they purchased. So that was the purchased emissions. And there were emissions associated with the capital goods company like Hitachi, Caterpillar, Japanese. And so how many emissions were involved in that? Well, now once we have Caterpillar doing this, then they can tell the mining company, okay, here's how many Scope 1 emissions we produce for this. And this is a useful lifetime of 8 years. And so you can spread those emissions, over the 8 years of production that you're doing. And so now everything is working. But that's why it may take 3 or 4 years for this recursive algorithm to go. But each iteration, we get better. We have more companies involved, and the data coming from the companies are more accurate. and will eventually converge to the idealized solution I outlined earlier in the talk.
Yeah. And I think it's picking up on the point around case studies and the pilots that you're doing. Are there any other key insights that you're already seeing coming through from those pilots so far?
One of the next ones Karthik mentioned is what seem like commodities are no longer commodities. Copper seemed like a commodity. No. I mean, the copper coming from the very clean mine and very rich ore in northern Sweden is very different than a copper that comes from a South American country, which has to be transported over many thousands of kilometers. And we see this over and over again. And that's why it's so important not to use averages here, but to look at the specifics of each company's supply chain. And as they follow Karthik's advice, which is not just use this as a measurement and a reporting tool, but a management tool to decarbonize. It becomes even, we set off a very positive feedback cycle for this to go on. So the story that commodities are no longer commodities in carbon space was certainly a big insight.
Yeah. The other insight that comes out of these pilots is, as Bob mentioned earlier, the system we've developed basically counts everything that's material in terms of emissions, but it counts it only once. And as it counts it, it allocates it to all of the products or activities that entity is producing. And that means it is a full allocation system, like a full equivalent to a full costing system. Once you start allocating your incurred emissions to your products, you get new insights into what products are actually clean versus dirty. Because if you have a partial allocation system, then the full emissions associated with producing something were never really known to you. So we've worked, for instance, with CFOs who have piloted this approach, who have had to produce EPDs now for many, many years as part of sort of various regulatory requirements, et cetera. And, these CFOs have said to us, for instance, I've never looked at an EPD for the purposes of my strategy, because by the time the EPD is produced, it's, admittedly 2-3 years out of date. But once you start this full allocation system in real time, things that you thought you were doing, which were clean, turn out to be dirty, and vice versa. So there are insights into that as well. And that kind of insight actually then goes not just within the company, but across industries. So for instance, in Europe in particular, there is an increasing regulatory trend towards, say, producing green steel. And this means moving away from the basic oxygen furnaces to the electric arc furnaces. Now, one of the outputs in the basic oxygen furnace process is slag. And slag is a key input into the manufacture of green cement. So if you move all of your steel mills to EAFs, then you actually start restricting the supply of slag in the market. And that means that you end up with dirtier cement than you did have before. So now this isn't to say that we shouldn't be moving to EAFs, et cetera. It is to say that once you start doing a full accounting across the supply chain, you realize that, well, certain decisions that seemingly were green are not, because now you're actually counting the moles of CO2 that are going into the atmosphere. And that's a really important insight that comes out of the pilots.
Yeah. So what we're saying, combining our comments here, is the world is not binary, but many environmentalists are treating the world as binary, which says you have to be green and not brown. You have to recycle and not use virgin materials. And we found that that's just not operational, nor is it often correct. But what is important is to reduce the quantity of carbon dioxide molecules going in the atmosphere. That's what we need to count. Count it once accurately and auditable. And that's what our e-ledger system does. It allows us to make decisions based on reducing the quantity of molecules going into the atmosphere.
And in terms of that underlying direct emissions, when you were doing the pilots, how much did you find people already had that information? Because of course, with Scope 3 accounting, a lot of organizations have already started to do that. And the challenge is that it doesn't necessarily flow through the system, but how much were you finding that actually those direct emissions were having to be calculated for the first time?
Two answers. One is, you're correct. They already had a very good starting point based on data that were already being provided to them, and that the suppliers had from their EPDs and their own calculations. And so this is great for version 1. You know, it gets us in the ballpark. It helps us identify which are likely the high carbon emissions that we really want to focus on. But the second part of that is often those data were pretty shaky. So for a tire company that we worked with, they learned that from one of their suppliers, the data came from a master's thesis by a Finnish doctoral student in 2017. You know, that had never been validated, but that was the information they had. You know, was it approximately right? Yeah, sure, must have been plus or minus 25 or 50%, but that's not the accuracy that we need and that we want to end up with. So the existing information, you know, gives us the opportunity to do version 1 quickly. You know, the more you have, then we can do that first cycle through very quickly, and then that gives us direction where we need to improve in subsequent iterations.
Now, one of the methodology is very much focused on the supply chain component. But of course, if you look at the current approach with Scope 3, also looks at that downstream consumption. So any entity in the system is looking at their full value chain and really trying to understand where they might have levers of influence. How are you thinking about that downstream consumption element, particularly when it comes to consumers who wouldn't then be passing it on to anyone else? And something like transport that's clearly a big component of emissions.
That's a great question. And basically, this is where I think the distinction between accounting and disclosure becomes really important. So what we are proposing is an accounting solution, and accounting is by definition historic in nature. It looks backward and says, what have I done? And it is then a basis for accountability. Now, when you look at a firm's financial statements, there are components to it that are historical in nature, which are accounting, which in the parlance of the SEC is called Reg SX filings. And then there are components of those financial statements, like the management discussion and analysis, that are prospective or forward-looking. Those are, by definition, somewhat speculative, and, you know, in SEC parlance called Reg SK filings. And so the solution, the e-liability solution, is intended to be about delivered performance, and therefore it is the accounting basis for carbon disclosure. There still is a very important role of downstream responsibility that, you know, you can think of within a Scope 3 type framework, where you say, okay, what happens with this product after it's sold? For instance, the tire company that Bob mentioned earlier. Now, part of the reason they're able to make their sale to their customer, which in this case is BMW, is this: BMW knows that in use by the end consumer, GT tires offer less friction on the road and therefore last longer, as well as have lower emissions, right? So as part of representing its tire to its customer BMW, and as part of BMW representing the whole product to the end consumer, that claim has to be made. That claim is part of those downstream emissions reporting, which is necessarily within sort of the frame of disclosure rather than accounting, right? Because no matter what GT says about how long-lasting the tire is, the consumer can drive the tire out of the showroom onto a nail, and then, you know, that is out of the control of the individual entity of the. So that's why that is separated.
Yeah, so on the disclosure, so we could get to a stage where companies that have visibility for their product or service for the end use consumer can tell you the CO2 emissions per unit of use, like per 10,000 kilometers driven. And that could be a fairly accurate number that maybe even could have some audit. So they can tell you that the rate at which emissions are being produced. What they can't predict or accurately measure is how much use they do. How many kilometers is that consumer going to drive? How many hours are they going to be doing video games? That by nature has to wait till that occurs at the consumer end. So you can get the partial information for a limited set of companies whose product or service is visible and actionable at the end use customer level, but they would not be able to tell you the quantity of use by that end use customer.
And moving into the, I guess, the asset side, we've talked almost about the liability side of the equation. There's obviously a lot of need for and focus on how do we draw carbon, GHG, out of the atmosphere. And we know that we're going to need that to stay within 1.5 degrees. how much can you say a little bit more about your thinking on how this might help with that?
Sure. So e-liabilities are just one side of the environmental ledger we're talking about, right? The other side of the environmental ledger is the environmental asset. And by an environmental asset, we mean a permanently or indefinitely sequestered removal offset, right? So just like you said, an environmental liability is the contribution or the addition of a mole of CO2 into the atmosphere. An environmental asset is taking equivalently a mole of CO2 from the atmosphere and permanently sequestering it or indefinitely sequestering it. The indefinite sequestration is important because anthropogenic CO2, as of current estimates, is liable to last in the atmosphere for about 1,000 years. That's a very long footprint that we're creating in the atmosphere. So that is part of where we start with the definition of what is an environmental asset. Now, there is no product or service that we know of anywhere in the world that can be truly made with zero e-liabilities, right? Because take something like a tire. Even if you said money, no object, and I'm willing to spend $1 million per tire, you will, at today's technology, and even imagining some advances in technology, not be able to get that emissions down to zero. So you're going to, if you want to produce net zero products and services, also equivalently engage in the activities of removal offsets. And that's where that becomes really important. So the environmental asset side of it is calculating and recording the permanent sequestered assets that a company has or an entity has engaged in. And the beauty of this is that at the end of the exercise, say the end of any reporting period, you've got an automatic definition of net zero that is true and fair auditable, in the sense that an entity is net zero if and only if its environmental liabilities at the end of a reporting period are matched by nettable environmental assets, right? So that then allows you to measure the path towards the progress to net zero. So what we've done in a parallel stream of work with our colleague, Mark Roston, who is at Stanford, is develop the foundational accounting principles for asset recognition, for asset netting, and for asset impairment of these removal offsets. And then say, once you get that accounting right, you can build an entire market ecosystem around it. You can build a thriving economy around it. Just like once the SEC in the 1930s got the definition of assets and liabilities on the financial side right, we unleashed tremendous amount of capital market activity. We can do the same with the carbon economy. And that's where that work is sitting now.
The next session that we're going to be looking at is around some of the latest reporting developments at the global and regional levels. I know a lot of people will be wanting to know how this fits in with what they might already be being asked to do. So Can you say a little bit about that? Is it complementary? Do you see it replacing some of the existing approaches? Where will it land?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the last thing we want to do is to create more of a reporting and regulatory burden on companies. Our focus in creating the solution is decarbonization, right? So we say to companies that are interested in piloting this approach, do it if you are looking for solutions for decarbonization in the sense of the Hitachi example that I gave. Don't do it if you're looking for a reporting solution for the sake of simply of some sort of external disclosure requirement. Now, that said, once you start this kind of real-time accounting and you start recognizing where are your real liabilities, where are your real emissions, and you start recognizing how you might decarbonize, then that actually feeds into the existing disclosure requirements. So whether you're reporting under, say, a GHG protocol type framework, or you're reporting on some other type of framework, or whether you're complying now with, say, the EU's CSRD directives, all of this information that we've talked about so far will allow that kind of reporting to become more accurate, right? So currently, for instance, if you're reporting on your scope 3, then you have to basically use industry and regional average estimates, et cetera. Whereas if you use this approach, then you can start more and more supplanting away that industry and regional average stuff with direct supplier-specific data that's come through your supply chain. That means the quality of your reporting gets better. And we think that over time, as more entities start doing this, imagine we get to a point where half of the Fortune 500 are doing this, then analysts are going to start looking at this and say, wait, if you're reporting under supplier-specific, that's when we are going to actually read it. if you're reporting under some sort of industry or sectoral average, then we're going to give it, perhaps a pass. So that's one way in which we can see that environment evolve over time.
Yeah, well, just summarizing that, this is the trajectory for companies under Scope 3 reporting to move from secondary data to primary data. Because basically our approach generates primary data all the way up a supply chain.
Fantastic. And we're nearly out of time. So one final question for each of you. If you wanted to leave one or two key takeaways or actions that you'd like to see everyone in the audience take, whether they're companies, investors, standard setters, regulators, or anyone from the wider A4S community, what actions would you like them to take to really achieve the kind of progress that you're talking about in that 3-year time frame?
Yeah, well, we can follow Phil Knight's original advice at Nike, which is just do it. Call us up. We're willing to support you in your pilot projects. We're a nonprofit. Karthik and I don't get compensated at all. We don't charge for our services. So dip your toe in the water and start the journey. And because we want to first learn from companies in more diverse industries that we haven't learned from different regions that have yet to start this. And so, by you coming to us, you help us improve the concept, makes it more implementable, and you get an early start on that 3 to 5 year journey.
Excellent. And I'd say for companies, I'd give different advice for companies and regulators. For companies, I'd say start thinking about decarbonization as a point of competitive differentiation. And then this accounting tool gives you the basis to identify where your decarbonization becomes a place where you can, earn more customers or make more profits. So that for regulators, I would say don't build regulatory solutions that rely exclusively on secondary data. Once you start creating an on-ramp to primary data, then you start driving excellence through the economy. Because that's when, if the world keeps using secondary data, there's no incentive to innovate. Whereas once you start saying, well, no, in 6 years, we want to be primary only, then you've created an on-ramp to excellence and decarbonization.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. Really great insights. And I think we'll have a lot of questions after this session. So we'll put some extra links in the alongside this session, and look forward to the follow-up. So thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Great to talk with you.
I'm now delighted to welcome Andrew Bonfield, CFO of Caterpillar and member of our CFO Leadership Network, to share some practical insights into the approach that Caterpillar has adopted to account for and address its Scope 3 emissions. Andrew, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Jessica. Great to be able to talk to you.
So let's just get stuck straight in. I think it's really important to set the context first. So can you summarize briefly Caterpillar's role in the transition to a net zero world?
Yeah. So Caterpillar has had sustainability as one of its values for a long time. Actually, values in action have been in operation for a number of years. And actually what we did last year was we actually put sustainability as to one of our 4 pillars behind our strategy. And the reason for that is twofold. One, which is actually, we do believe Caterpillar will help the energy transition take place. If you think about all the minerals that have to be mined in order to make the transition, copper, nickel, lithium, cadmium, and so forth, that requires a lot of mining to take place. Caterpillar produces the very large mining trucks that you may have seen. We are one of the major producers of those. And so that expands our potential total addressable market. Also, if you think about wind farms and solar farms, every time you've got one of those, you need a piece of construction equipment to move the earth to be able to prepare the site. So that to us is a huge opportunity for us in the long term. Second part of it, obviously, is how do we make our machines more efficient and more effective? And we've been working for a long time on doing that, reducing emissions from our machines, but also thinking about how we can move to a battery electric world as well for a lot of our machines, or other alternative fuels. So things like hydrogen, or biofuels, HVA. All of those things are part of that transition. And a lot of work is going into there. It's not easy. It's very complex because it's not like when you're driving, for example, a large mining truck. We've done a prototype, which hopefully we'll have in the market by 2027. But that mining truck will require almost continuous battery charging, whereas you can drive your car probably for a week without charging it, because of these machines are working 24/7. So it requires a lot of complex engineering, and that's part of what we're doing as well, trying to make that, and at the same time finding other ways to help make our products much more efficient and much more sustainable for our customers as they go through their journeys to net zero.
And obviously, to help inform some of those decisions that you're talking about, it's really important to understand what your emissions are and where they might exist, not only in your own operations, but along your whole value chain. So can you say a little bit more about your accounting for your emissions and why they're important, where the biggest emissions along your value chain exist?
Yeah. So like many companies, we've had Scope 1, Scope 2 targets for a number of years and have consistently been reducing our own emissions that we can directly control in our business operations. And we have a target for another 30% reduction by 2030 from already levels that have been reduced significantly over the last couple of decades. For our customers, obviously, Scope 3 is the next part of the journey. And we agreed as part of one of our shareholder proposals, which the board actually supported, to adopt TCFD and actually to also disclose our Scope 3 emissions, which we did for the first time in our 2022 sustainability report. Why is it important? It's important for our customers to understand the emissions they're making. And obviously, our Scope 3 are their Scope 1 and Scope 2, which is part of actually how we start to actually address this from a journey perspective. And obviously now people are trying to understand and actually get explanations from us as part of their reporting. How do they understand how we describe our emissions, what our Scope 3 emissions are, and they can then use them in their own sustainability journeys themselves. And where do we have a significant, a lot of the emissions, we operate a lot in the oil and gas space. So whilst obviously fossil fuels are still needed today as part of the transition, we can't have the transition without them. The vast majority of ours actually relate to oil and gas businesses, whether it's reciprocating engines, which are used for gas compression, for example, at a frac site, or solar turbines, where we actually do gas compression on gas pipelines. So our emissions, our Scope 3 are quite large, and they're much larger than our Scope 1 and Scope 2. And we've obviously then go around to our customers to try and help them understand how they can actually reduce those over time. And
I think if I'm right, I read that it was sort of about 95% of your total is your customer Scope 3 emissions.
Yes,
it
is. Yeah. Yes, it's correct. It's a very substantial proportion.
Yeah. So can you say one of the things that a lot of organisations are in the midst of trying to do is indeed calculate their Scope 3 emissions and measure them. You've already published yours, so can you say a little bit about how you've gone about calculating them?
Yeah, so we decided, obviously we looked through the different options, and let's be honest about it, at the moment there are quite a range of options that people can use for Scope 3. We decided to be as transparent as possible. So obviously we look at emissions over the life of the product sold. And that includes rebuilds and remanufacturing. You are actually under the rules allowed to go to the first rebuild, but actually Caterpillar, we have a view of the world that our machines are built to be rebuilt. That reduces the total cost of ownership for our customers, makes our machines more productive. So therefore what we did is we actually took it for the full life of the product. So we went through all our product portfolios estimated what the total life is, worked out what the emissions are by product, and then multiply that by the volume in each year. So that's the way we've calculated that. And obviously that, that then can be used and actually, so then we'll calculate by product line and so forth, what our scope 3 emissions are. Obviously, what is going to happen, what we're getting ready for is both CSRD in Europe, because we will be caught by those rules as a large, we still sell a lot of machines in Europe and have large European operations, and also obviously ahead of the SEC rules. And obviously finance plays a role in that. Actually, the strategy and sustainability that actually will report into me. Our new Chief Sustainability Officer is also our Chief Strategy Officer who reports to me. And actually finance, we've set up an ESG controller to get ready, because if we do end up with SEC reporting, and this file forms part of your 10K each year, it will be audited and will need to have the same sort of level of controls as you will do over Sarbanes-Oxley financial reporting information, which is a lot of work for the finance teams.
Yeah. So can you say a little bit more about then what that finance team role is? You touched on having an ESG or a sustainability controller. Can you say a little bit more about how they're really helping to get you ready for presumably also assurance, particularly if you're reporting under European standards?
Yes, that's the biggest part, I think, for everybody. I think for all corporates on this is making sure that you are set up, enabling yourself to have those controls over the reporting, which will enable you then to have Sarbanes-Oxley. So, that really, the assurance is really going to be part of it. I think it's going to be a crucial part of the work that needs to be done. Finance, because obviously we have the mechanisms under what we do for all parts of financial reporting. Sustainability reporting obviously fits very easily within that control mechanisms and framework, which is again by the reason why we set up a very senior finance executive to become our ESG controller, to get ready for all the work will need to be done, and to make sure that we understand from an operational perspective, each of our business units understand what they will be required to do, because there's a whole training mechanism. I think unfortunately for us as a US corporate, we're slightly ahead of the UK, for example, on SOX reporting for those who are only just starting. The UK light SOX approach is going to happen, but that assurance will require a lot of work as well. And so obviously getting ready for that. So even though the final SEC rules have not yet come out, we are preparing for that. And obviously with CSRD, that is also obviously going to catch, as I say, we're going to be caught by those rules and be required to report under that. So again, that just helps us be ready for that as well. So it's a plus from that perspective. Yeah.
And the last session today, we're going to be exploring some of the early reporting around CSRD and preparation for it. So definitely recommend people watch in or tune in for that session, because it's pretty extensive.
It is very extensive. It's very comprehensive, and it is going to require a lot of work. And again, one of the reasons why when we looked at scope 3 emissions, we decided to go over the full life of the product is, I think, if you think about it over time, it is much more, I think, from a overall assurance perspective, it's much easier to look at that rather than trying to determine, when the first rebuild could happen or when the first refurbishment could happen of a particular product line. So it's thinking like that. And in the industrial economy, that is something which you just have to keep in mind as you go through.
And of course, important to be ready for reporting, but this data and the information around scope 3 emissions and emissions as a whole, presumably is something that you really need and is important for your internal decisions as well, for your management information, to be able to sell your products to you and talk about your products with your customers, and indeed for some of the investment decisions that you might be taking. Can you say a bit more about how you're using this information to drive management decisions and investment rather than just reporting?
Yeah, so obviously, a lot of our customers come to us now, we're slightly different from other businesses particularly on the off-highway side, machines are not yet in a situation where regulatory environment has run ahead of it and said, you need to be, battery electric by a certain date. The internal combustion engine can't work by a certain date. But a lot of our customers are public companies as well, and they have their own ESG goals and standards that they're applying. So, for example, the large mining companies, we work very closely with them, all of them. And so, it's about making sure we're ready to help them. And the pace of change for us will occur really by customer segment. So, for example, where we're furthest ahead, probably more than anywhere else, is around things like mining, for example, because a lot of our large customers, we have 6 pilots, which are to create different environments in which large mining trucks will operate on a battery electric scenario, and then how they will operate the site. So they probably will need autonomous mining. We are a world leader in autonomous mining. We move more than 5 billion tons of dirt autonomously. We've driven more than 200 million kilometers autonomously on our sites. That's going to be an important part of that as well, to enable them to work the site as well. So all of that is part of what that is. And that information about what emissions they save is an important part. For them, it's their largest source of carbon emissions. So for them, it's important that they find ways to move away from diesel to other forms of other fuel sources, whether it be electric, battery electric, or possibly even biofuels and so forth, to make that work and to reduce their emissions. So I think that's all how you do it. And even, a lot of our customers are coming to us and saying, well, what can we do? So for example, if you take often what used to happen on a fracking site, used to run a diesel engine on a fracking site. So people will really bring in diesel on a truck. So there's emissions associated with that. They would then obviously use the diesel engine, so diesel, but then they'd be burning gas because there's too much gas often coming out of a well, and they'd be flaring the gas. So putting more emissions into the atmosphere. We've created a thing called a dynamic gas blend engine, which uses 85% natural gas. So actually taking the gas and treating it, using it instead of being flared, stopping the need for a truck to come in, stopping diesel, so reduced emissions because it's gas rather than diesel, to run the engine. And so that actually enables a much bigger reduction. So again, I think it's about customer by customer interaction. It's all part of that. The biggest challenge for us is around working out when the returns are going to happen. So we're making substantial investments in electrification. And one of the challenges normally is we would always go and say, okay, we would do an NPV calculation as traditional, like all finance people. We love our net present value calculations and do the DCF of future cash flows. And we would then go and say, well, that part of the business is responsible for that part of the cash flow. This part is responsible for that. You cannot do that in this environment, in this way, because there is no certainty as to when revenues will start to flow. So we're making a lot of these investments and trying to look at it on a much, not purely just from a financial basis, looking at the longer term, but also trying to understand what do we need to believe will be the benefit for us from doing that. So that's how we're having to do it, which is a little bit of different thinking for some of our finance folk, rather than purely because obviously, these are significant investments. They are not small dollars. They are very large numbers. And we're having to work and sort of think through how we manage all of that within the financial parameters we operate in as a company. We have a fiduciary duty, so we have to balance that all out, which is challenging mostly compared to the ways we normally work.
Yeah, and in that context, I mean, presumably, if you look at to your point, if you look at where the direction of travel with your customers and some of the commitments that they've made, there's a significant value at risk in terms of sales if you don't make some of these investments now. So presumably, yes. Is that the kind of mindset that you're trying to?
It's table stakes. I mean, we have to do it. So we work with our customers. So for example, on the 6 pilots that we're working with large mining companies, they will contribute some of the cost towards doing that. But generally, there's still a lot more, cost to us than it is to them. But the point being is to get that dual commitment away. And yes, there's value potential, you know, for us, back to this point about the expanding the total addressable market. And I talked a little bit about the mindset of the future, but for us, there's a possibility if we get this right, we can actually capture more of the market share, a higher proportion of revenue, because we can provide ancillary services. So we have, for example, an electric power business, which understands storage, understands microgrids, understands how you operate backup generation, all of those things, which are all going to have to be part of the mix. Continuous charging, how do you do that? We already actually have mining trucks that operate on tram lines. We're trying to find alternative ways of making it more efficient. So actually bringing that, adding incremental value, so actually it's that incremental value you can add, which actually helps you capture more of the market and expand the market at the same time, is really important for us. So that's why we think it's a really good investment.
Yeah. And did it take much to convince your board when you've been talking through these kind of investments and the direction of travel? How did you get them comfortable?
Yeah, I think like all boards, boards understand, climate change is something, and sustainability is something we all have to adopt and look at. So they understand that. I mean, obviously, they realize that this is almost table stakes for a business like us. So they were very supportive of what we're trying to do. So the good news is we didn't have to spend a lot of time with a lot of skeptical board members. People understand that this is part of our business. You know, we historically, companies like us have gone through emission standards changes quite regularly. So they understand the need always to improve that. And that's, as I say, it's always been part of the company's values. So that, you know, so we've always had that as part of our, you know, values that the company operates under. So the board understand that, and that just helped some of those conversations.
Yeah. So final question before we're out of time. So what tips do you have for others who might be earlier in this journey? So particularly around accounting for Scope 3, but also some of that broader mindset shift that you've been talking about.
Yeah. Make sure that, you know, I mean, make sure a couple of things. One, which is you spend the time to investigate and understand. The CEO and I actually had virtually a monthly meeting with our sustainability team before we got to our Scope 3 emissions to actually understand how they could be calculated and what was part of the calculation methodology. We also educated all the members of our executive office as part of that process as well. So education is really key to understand part of their journey, because I think if you don't, and you don't ask questions, you just assume the organization will work it through. That's not, because there are lots of options. You have to make value-based decisions about what those options are, because otherwise you can end up in a situation where you can be criticized. I'll give you one example very quickly. It's one of the things we found as part of our review of what other companies were doing and learning and understanding. There was a division sold from one company to another, and we understood what the divisions, the previous company disclosed its Scope 3 emissions for that division. They went down by 80% when they moved to the new company because they changed the assumption methodology. I would say challenge people just to say, understand what your methodology is and look at it assuming you're going to be making long-term decisions about this and not something for the short term. Don't just minimize it because that's the most comfortable place to be. Think about what is the right way to look at it, because ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to be asked by investors and people on the outside why you've made those Scope 3 decisions. So I think you've got to really understand it. And secondly, make sure the organization is ready. And, you know, we have done a lot of work to try and prepare the organization to get ready for the disclosure obligations, as I say, and we've still got a lot more work to do to get that. But what you don't want to do is go and then find 2 years later you're restating everything because your methodology was wrong and or you didn't have the right controls over it. So I think those are things which, as any CFO, I would say just the same as any new accounting standard, think about it like that. That's probably the best way to think about it. You've got to do your homework. You've got to do your preparation. and then you've got to implement it as in the best way possible.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Andrew. Really helpful. And I think through the CFO leadership, yourselves and others are sharing lots of really great tips and case studies and examples to help everyone on that journey. But I think two things that everyone should be thinking about off the back of this. So thank you very much for sharing those insights.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica.
Huge thanks again to Bob, Karthik, and to Andrew for sharing those insights into how we can get some innovation and account for our Scope 3 emissions, as well as the insights into what that information can really help to drive as we transition to a net zero, nature positive world. Our next session is going to be deep diving into the International Sustainability Standards Board. That's, of course, been one of the really big developments in the last couple of years. So we're really pleased to have ISSB board member with us and a number of others providing perspectives on whether the ISSB is becoming the global standard, how it's operable, and the kind of things you can think about in terms of applying those standards in practice. So look forward to seeing you again in an hour.